We're back. So before I start up, want to start a startup? Get funded by Y Combinator. So this is supposed to be a guest lecture by Sam Altman at Stanford. So he wrote about that thing. Let's read it. October 2014. This is derived from the guest lecture of Sam Altman startup class at Stanford. It's intended for college students, but much of it is applicable to potential founders at all other ages. One of the advantages of having kids is that when you have to give advice, you can ask yourself, what would I tell my own kids? My kids are little, but I can imagine what I'd tell them about startup if they were in college. That's what I'm going to tell you. Startups are very counterintuitive. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's just because knowledge about them hasn't permeated our culture yet. But whatever the reason, starting a startup is a task where you can't always trust your instincts. It's like skiing in that way. When you first try skiing, you want to slow down. Your instinct is to lean back. But if you lean back on skis, you fly down the hill out of control. So part of learning to ski is learning to suppress that impulse. Eventually, you get new habits, but at first it takes a conscious effort. At first, there is a list of things you're trying to remember as you start down the hill. Startups are as unnatural as skiing. So there is a similar list for startups. Here I'm going to give you the first part of it, the things to remember if you want to prepare yourself to start a startup. Counterintuitive. The first item on it is the fact that I already mentioned. The startups are so weird that if you trust your instincts, you'll make a lot of mistakes. If you know nothing more than this, you may at least pause before making them. When I was running Y Combinator, I used to joke that our function was to tell founders things they wouldn't know. It's really true. Batch after batch, the YC partners warn founders about mistakes they are about to make, and the founders ignore them, and then come back a year later say, "I wish we listened." Why do founders ignore partners' advice? Well, that's the thing about counterintuitive ideas. They contradict they contradict your intuitions. They seem wrong. Of course, your first impulse is to disregard them. And in fact, my joking description is not merely a curse of Y Combinator, but part is its raison d'etre. If founders' instincts already gave them the right answers, they wouldn't need us. You only need other people to give you advice that surprise you. That's why there are a lot of ski instructors and not many running instructors. You can, however, trust your instincts about people. And in fact, one of the most common mistakes young founders make is not to do that enough. They get involved with people who seem impressive but about whom they feel some misgivings personally. Later, when things blow up, they say, "I knew there was something off about him, but I ignored it because he seemed so impressive." If you are thinking about getting involved with someone as a co-founder, an employee, an investor, or an acquirer, and you have misgivings about them, trust your gut. If someone seems slippery or bogus or a jerk, don't ignore it. This is one case where it pays to be self-indulgent. Work with people you genuinely like and you've known long enough to be sure. Expertise. The second continuative part is that it's not it's not that important to know about a lot about startups. The way to succeed in a startup is not to be an expert on startups, but to be expert on your users and the problem you are solving for them. Mark Zuckerberg didn't succeed because he was an expert in startups. He succeeded despite being a complete noob at startups because he understood his users really well. If you don't know anything about, say, how to raise an angel round, don't feel bad on that account. That sort of thing you can learn when you need to and forget when you've done it. In fact, I worry it's not merely unnecessary to learn in great detail about the mechanics of startups, but possibly somewhat dangerous. If I met an undergrad who knew all about convertible notes and employee agreements and, God forbid, Class FF stock, I wouldn't think he is someone who is way ahead of his peers. It would set off alarms. Because another of the characteristics mistakes of young founders is go through the motions of starting a startup. They make up some plausible sounding idea, raise money at good valuation, rent a cool office, hire a bunch of people. But from outside, that seems like what startups do. But the next step after rent a cool office and hire a bunch of people is gradually realize how completely fucked they are. Because while imitating all the outward forms of startups, they have neglected one thing that's actually essential: making something people want. Game. We saw this happen so often that we made up a name for it: playing house. Eventually, I realized why it was happening. The reason young founders go through the motions of starting a startup is because that's what they've been trained to do for their whole lives to that point. Think about what you have to do to get to college, for example. Extracurricular activities, check. Even in college classes, most of the work is as artificial as learning labs. I'm not attacking the education system for being this way. There will always be a certain amount of fakeness in the work you do when you're being taught something. And if you measure their performance, it's inevitable that the people will exploit the difference to the point where much of what you're measuring is artifacts of the failure, fakeness. I confess, I did it myself in college. I found that a lot of classes are there might be only 20 to 30 ideas that were the right shape to make good exam questions. The way I studied for exams in classes was not to master the material taught in class, but to make a list of potential exam questions, work out the answers in advance, and I walked to the final. The main thing I'd be feeling was curiosity about which of the questions would turn up on the exam, and it was the game. This was something I actually learned from Paul Graham, right? Exactly the same things. To figure out the tricks for winning at this game. Since fundraising appears to be measure of success for startups, another class no mistake, they always want to know what tricks are for convincing custom investors. We tell them the best way to convince investors is to make startup that's actually doing well, meaning growing fast, and simply tell investors so. Then they want to know what tricks are for growing fast. And we have to tell them the best way to do that is simply make something people want. This is just fundamentals. Fire. hours. Bro, come on. This is all something I've already read. I hope there is something I didn't read in the. Anyway, let's just say I'll read it again. Oh my gosh. She just woke up. Oh my gosh. So this is a counterintuitive thing. Gaming the system may continue to work if you work for a big company. Depending on how broken the company is, you can succeed by sucking up into the right people, giving the impression of productivity and so on. But that doesn't work with startups. There is no boss to trick, only users, and the users care about is whether your product does what they want. Startups are as impersonal as physics. So then just focus on getting a good product, right? That's also a game. Get a good product. You can game for that as well. What's wrong with people? But that doesn't work with startups. There is no boss to trick. Okay, you have to make something people want, and the purpose only is to extend to the extent you do. The dangerous thing is faking does work to some degree on investors. If you're super good at sounding like you know what you're talking about, you can fool investors at least one or perhaps even two rounds of funding. But it's not in your interest to. The company is ultimately doomed. All you're doing is waste your own time writing down. So stop looking for the trick. There are tricks in startups as there are in any domain, but they are an order of magnitude less important than solving the real problem. A founder who knows nothing about fundraising but has made something users love will have an easier time raising money than who knows every trick in the book but has a flat usage graph. And more importantly, the founder who has made something users love is the one who will go on to succeed after raising the money. All right. Though in a sense, it's bad news in you're deprived of one of your powerful weapons. I think it's exciting that gaming the system stops working when you start a startup. It's exciting that there even exist the parts of world where you win by doing good work. Imagine how depressing the world would be if it were to if it were all like school and big companies where you either have to spend a lot of time on bullshit things or lose people who do. I would have been delighted if I'd realized that in college there were parts of the real world where the gaming the system mattered less than others, and few where it hardly mattered at all. But there are this variation of one of the most important things to consider when you're thinking about your future. How do you win in each type of work? What would you like to win by doing it? I don't understand. Okay, that's fun. That brings us to a fourth counterintuitive part. Startups are all consuming. If you start a startup, it will take over your life to a degree you can't imagine. And if your startup succeeds, it will take off you over your life for a long time. For several years, at least for a very least, maybe for a decade, maybe for the rest of your working life. So there is a real opportunity cost there. Larry Page may seem to have an enviable wife, but there are aspects of it that are unenviable. Basically, at 25, he started running as fast as he could, and must seem to him that he hasn't stopped to catch his breath since. Every day, new shit happens in the Google empire that only the CEO can deal with, and he, as the CEO, has to deal with it. If he goes on a vacation for even a week, the whole week's backlog of shit accumulates, and he has to bear this uncomplainingly. Partly because as the company's daddy, he can never show fear or weakness, and partly because billionaires get less than zero sympathy if they talk about having difficult life, which has the strange side effect that the difficulty of being successful startup founder is concealed from almost everyone except those who have done it. Alright, Y Combinator has now funded several companies that can be called big successes, and in every single case, the founders say the same thing: it never gets any easier. The nature of the problem since you're worrying about construction delays on our London office instead of broken air conditioner in your studio apartment. But the volume of worry never decreases, it always increases. Starting a successful startup is similar to having kids in that it's like a button you push that changes your life irrevocably. And while it's truly wonderful having kids, there are a lot of things that are easier to do before you have them than after, many of which will make you better parent when you do have kids. Since you can delay pushing the button for a while, most of the rich countries do. Yet, when it comes to startups, a lot of people seem to think they are supposed to start them while they are in college. Are you crazy? What are the universities thinking? They go out of the way to ensure students are well supplied with contraceptives, and yet they are setting up entrepreneurship programs and startup incubators left and right. To be fair, universities have their hand forced here. A lot of incoming students are interested in startups. Universities are, at least the de facto, expected to prepare them for their careers. So the students who want to start startups hope universities can teach them about startups. And whether universities can do this or not, there is some pressure to claim they can, lest they lose applicants over other universities what that do. Can universities teach students about startups? Yes and no. They can teach students about startups as I explained before. This is not what you need to know. What you need to learn about is the needs of your own users. And you can't do that until you actually start a company. So starting a startup is intrinsically something you can only learn by doing it. And it's impossible to do that in college for the reason I just explained. Startups take over your life. You can't start a startup for real as a student because you can't start a startup for real. You're not a student anymore. If you start a startup for real, you're not a student anymore. You may be nominally a student for a bit, but you won't even be that for long. Given this dichotomy, which of the two paths you take? Be a real student or start a startup, or start a real startup or not be a student? I can answer that one for you. Do not start a startup in college. How to start a startup is just a subset of bigger problems you're trying to solve. How to have a good life, and that and though starting a startup can be a part of good life for a lot of ambitious people, age 20 is not optimal time to do it. Starting a startup is like a brutally fast depth first search. People Most people should still be searching breadth first at 20. You can do things in your early 20s that you can't do well before or after, like plunge deeply into projects on a whim or travel super cheaply with no sense of deadline. For unambitious people, this sort of thing is dreaded failure to launch, but for ambitious one, it can be incomparably valuable sort of exploration. If you start by 20, you're sufficiently successful, but you'll never get to do it. Mark Zuckerberg will never get to bum around a foreign country. You can never do other things. He can do other things most people can't, like charter jets fly to him to foreign countries. But success has taken a lot of serendipity out of his life. Facebook is running him as much as he's running Facebook. And while it can be very cool to be in the grip of a project you consider your life's work, there are advantages to serendipity too, especially in early in life. Among the other things that it gives you more options to choose your life's work form. There is not even a trade-off here. If you're not sacrificing anything if you forego starting a startup at 20, because you are more likely to succeed if you wait. In the unlikely case that you are 20 and one of the side projects takes off like Facebook did, you will face a choice of running with it or not, and it may reasonably it may be reasonable to run with it. But the unusual way startups take off is for the founders to make them take off, and the gratuitously stupid. It's gratuitously stupid to do that at 20. Try. Should you try it at any age? I realized I've made startups sound pretty hard. If I haven't, let me try again. Starting a startup is really hard. What if it's too hard? How can you tell if you're up to this challenge? The answer is the fifth counterintuitive part. You can't tell. Your life so far may have given some idea of what your prospects might be if you try to become a mathematician or professional football player, but unless you have had a very strange life, you haven't done much. That was like being a startup founder. Starting a startup will change you a lot. So what you're trying to estimate is not just what you are, but you could grow into. Who can do that? For the past 9 years, it was my job to predict whether people would have what it took to start successful startups. It was easy to tell how smart they were, and most people reading this will be over that threshold. The hard part was predicting how tough and ambitious they would become. There may be no one who has more experience at trying to predict that, so I can tell you how much an expert can know about it. The answer is not much. I learned to keep it completely open-minded about which startups in each batch would turn out to be the stars. The founders sometimes think they know. Some arrive feeling sure that they will ace Y Combinator, just as they ace every one of them. Few artificial easy tests they faced in the life so far. Others arrive wondering how they got in and hoping YC doesn't discover whatever the mistake caused it to accept them. But there is a little correlation between founders' initial attitudes and how well their companies do. I've read that the same is true in the military, that the swaggering results recruits who are no more likely to turn out to be the real tough than the quiet ones. And probably for the same reason that the tests involved are so different from the others in their previous lives. If you're absolutely if you're absolutely terrified of starting a startup, of starting a startup, you probably shouldn't do it. But if you're merely unsure whether you are up to it, the only way to find out is try. Just not now. Ideas. So if you want to start a startup one day, what should you do? What should you do in college? There are only two things you need to do. You need initially an idea and co-founders. And the MO for getting both is the same, which leads to a sixth and last counterintuitive part. The way to get startup ideas is not to try to think about startup ideas. I've written a whole essay on this, and so I won't repeat it all here. But the short version is that if you make a conscious effort to think about startup ideas, the ideas you come up with will not merely be bad but bad and plausible sounding, meaning you will waste a lot of time on them before realizing they are bad. The way to come up with good startup ideas is to take a step back. Instead of making conscious effort to think about startup ideas, turn your mind into a type that startup ideas form in without any conscious effort. In fact, so unconsciously that you don't even realize at first that they are startup ideas. This is not only possible, that's how Apple, Yahoo, Google, and Facebook all got started. None of these companies were even meant to be companies at first. They were all just side projects. And the best startups all the almost have to start as side projects because great ideas tend to be such outliers that your conscious mind will reject them as ideas for companies. So how do you turn your mind into the type that startup ideas formed unconsciously? Learn a lot about things that matter, then work on problems that interest you with people you like and respect. And the third part, incidentally, is how you get co-founders at the same time as the idea. The first time I wrote a paragraph, instead of learn a lot about things that matter, I wrote become good at some technology. But the prescription, though if sufficient, is too narrow. What was special about Brian Klczewski and Joe Gebbia was not that they were experts in technology. They were good at design, perhaps even more importantly, they were good at organizing groups and making projects happen. So you don't have to work on technology per se, so long as you work on problems demanding enough to stretch you. What kind of problems are those? That is very hard to answer in the general case. History is full of examples of young people who were working on important problems that no one else at the time thought were important, and in particular, that their parents didn't think were important. On the other hand, history is even full of examples of parents who thought their kids were wasting their time and who were right. So, how do you know when you're working on real stuff? I know how I know. Real problems are interesting, and I am self-indulgent in that sense that I always want to work on interesting things, even if no one else cares about them, and find it very hard to make myself work on boring things, even if they're supposed to be important. My life is full of case after case where I worked on something just because it seemed interesting and turned out later it is to be useful in somewhat worldly way. Y Combinator itself is something I only did because it seemed interesting. So I seem to have some sort of internal compass that helps me out, but I don't know what other people have in their heads. Maybe if I think more about this, I can come up with the heuristics for recognizing genuinely interesting problems, but for the moment, the best I can offer is hopelessly question begging advice that If you have taste for genuinely interesting problems, indulging it energetically is the best way to prepare yourself for a startup, and indeed, probably also the best way to live. But although I can't explain in the general sense what counts as a interesting problem, I can tell you about the large subset of them. If you think of technology as something that's spreading like a sort of fractal stain, every moving point of the edge represents an interesting problem. So one guaranteed way to turn your mind into the type that has good startup ideas is to get yourself the leading edge of some technology, to cause yourself as a pawn budget put it to live in the future. When you reach that point, ideas will seem to other people canonically prescient, will seem obvious to you. You may not realize they are startup ideas, but you'll know there's something that ought to exist. For example, back in the Harvard in the mid 90s, a fellow grad student of my friends Robert and Trevor wrote his own voice over IP software. He didn't mean it to be a software and he never tried to turn it into one. He just wanted to talk to his girlfriend on Taiwan without paying for long distance calls. Since he was an expert on networks, it seemed obvious to him that the way distance calls to do it is to turn the sound into packets and ship it over the internet. He never did it any more with his software than talk to his girlfriend, but this is exactly the way best startups get started. So strangely enough, the optimal thing to do in college, if you want to be a successful startup founder, is not some sort of new vocational version of college focused on entrepreneurship. It's classic version of college as education for its own sake. If you want to start a startup after college, what you should do in college is to learn powerful things. And if you have genuine intellectual curiosity, that's what you'll naturally tend to do if you just follow your own inclinations. The component of entrepreneurship that really matters is domain expertise. The way to become Larry Page was to become an expert on search, and the way to become an expert on search was to be driven by genuine curiosity, not some ulterior motive. At its best, starting a startup is merely an ulterior motive for curiosity, and you will do it best if you introduce the ulterior motive toward the end of the process. So here is ulterior advice for young would-be founders boiled down to two words: just learn. Boiled down to two words: just learn, baby. Just learn, baby. He hasn't told anything interesting in this. Oh my god, what a waste of time. Here it is again. I hope this is interesting instead of just duplication of another article. Maybe I actually completed reading whatever it is there on his mind, right? That's why everything seems repeated. That may be the reason. That exactly is the reason. Do things at own scale. That's an interesting title. Okay, again. Anyways. Oh. Okay, that's interesting. How to raise money. This seems very interesting. This is useful, maybe. Alright. That hurts. Oh my god. How many times will I hurt myself? Oh gosh. Oh, that hurts. Ugh. Man, please. Oh gosh, this breakdown. Alright, we're back. Most startups that raise money do it more than once. A typical trajectory might be one to get started with a few tens of thousands from something like Y Combinator or individual angels, and then raise a few hundred thousands to a few million to build a company. And then, once the company is clearly succeeding, raise one or more two rounds to accelerate growth. Reality can be messier. Some companies raise money twice in phase 2. Some skip phase 1 and go straight to phase 2. And at Y Combinator, we get an interesting number of companies that have already raised amounts of hundreds of thousands, but there are three phase path is at least the one about which individual startup paths oscillate. This is a focuses on phase 2 fundraising. That's the type of startups we found fund are doing on demo day. And this essay is about advice we give them. Forces. Fundraising is hard in both senses, hard like lifting heavy weight and hard like solving a puzzle. It's hard like lifting heavy weight because it's intrinsically hard to convince people to be part of with some large sums of money, to part with some large sums of money. And the problem is irreducible. It should be hard, but much of the other kind of difficulty it can be eliminated. Fundraising only seems a puzzle because it's an alien world to most founders, and the hope to fix that by supplying a map through it. To founders, the behaviors of investors is always often opaque, partly because their motivations are obscure, and partly because they deliberately mislead you. And if the misleading ways of investors combine horribly with the wishful thinking of inexperienced founders, at YC we are always warning founders about this danger. The investors are probably the most circumspect with YC startups than with other companies they talk to. And even so, we witness a constant series of explosions as these two volatile components combine. If you are an inexperienced founder, the only way to survive is by imposing external constraints on yourself. You can't trust your intuitions. I'm going to give you a set of rules here that will get you through through this process, if anything will. At certain moments, you will be tempted to ignore them. So, rule number zero is this rule exists for a reason. You wouldn't need a rule to keep you going in one direction if there wasn't powerful forces pushing you in other. Ultimate source of forces acting on you are forces acting on investors. Investors are pinched between two kinds of fear of investing in startup that fizzle, and fear of missing out on startup that take off. And the cause of all this fear is very thing that makes startups such an attractive investments. The successful ones grow very fast, but the fast growth means investors can't wait around. If you wait till startup is obviously a success, it's too late. To get really high returns, you have to invest in startups when it's unclear how they'll do. But that in turn makes investors nervous. They're about to invest in a flop, as indeed they often are. What investors would like to do if they could is wait. When a startup is only a few months old, every week that passes gives you significantly more information about them. And if you wait too long, other investors might take a deal away from you. And of course, the other investors are all subject to the same forces. So what tends to happen is that they all wait as long as they can, and then when some act, the rest have to. Don't raise money unless you want it, and it wants you. Such a high proportion of successful startups raise money that it might seem fundraising is one of the defining qualities of startup. Actually, it isn't. Rapid growth is what makes a company a startup. Most companies in a position to grow rapidly find that taking outside money helps them grow faster, and their growth potential makes it easy to attract much money. It's so common for both A and B to be true of successful startup, and practically all do raise outside money. But there may be cases where a startup either wouldn't want to grow faster or outside money wouldn't help them to. And if you're one of them, don't raise money. The other time not to raise money is when you won't be able to. If you try to raise money before you can convince investors, you will not only waste your time but also burn your reputation with those investors. But in fundraising mode, be in fundraising mode or not, one of the things that surprises founders most about fundraising is how distracting it is. When you start fundraising, everything else grinds to a halt. The problem is not the time fundraising consumes, but that it becomes a top idea in your mind. A startup can't endure that level of distraction for long. An early stage startup grows mostly because the founders make it grow. If the founders look away, growth usually drops sharply. Because fundraising is so distracting, a startup should either be fundraising mode or not. And when you do decide to raise money, you should focus on your whole attention on it so you can get it done quickly and get back to work. If you can take money from investors when you're not fundraising mode. When you're not in fundraising mode, you can't just expend any attention on it. There are two things that take attention: convincing investors and negotiating with them. So when you're not in fundraising mode, you should take money from investors only if they require no convincing and are willing to invest on terms you'll take without any negotiation. For example, if a reputable investor is willing to invest on a convertible note using standard paperwork that is either uncapped or capped at a good valuation. That is either uncapped or capped at a good valuation. You can take that without having to think. The terms will be whatever they turn out to be your next equity round. And no convincing means just that: zero time spent on investors or preparing materials for them. If the investor says they are ready to invest but need you to come in for one meeting or meet some of the partners, tell them no. If you're not fundraising mode because it's fundraising, tell them politely, tell them you're focusing on the company right now and you'll get back to them when you're fundraising. But do not get sucked down the slippery slope. That's an important advice. Well. Hmm. आज शुरू करना है. There's no way I can escape that. I got assignments. Oh my gosh. I can't ignore it. Investors will try to lure you into fundraising when you're not. It's great for them if they can, because they can thereby get a shot at you before everyone else. They'll send you emails saying we want to meet you, learn more about you. If you get cold mated by an associate about at a VC firm, you shouldn't meet them even if you are in fundraising mode. Deals don't happen that way. But even if you get an email from a partner, you should try to delay meeting till you are in fundraising mode. They may say that they just want to meet you and chat, but investors never just want to meet and chat. What if they like you? What if they start talking about giving you money? Will you be able to resist having that conversation? Unless you are experienced enough fundraising to have casual conversations with investors that stays casual, it's safer to tell them that you would be happy to later when you're fundraising, but that nah, right now you need to focus on the company. Milliseconds. Yeah, oh gosh. What am I doing? What am I doing? Oh, companies that are successful at raising money in phase 2 become track and fewest investors after leaving fundraising mode. This is fine. If fundraising went well, you'll be able to do it without spending time convincing them or negotiating about terms. Get introductions to investors. Joke like that. Yeah, I joke. Before you can talk to investors, you have to be introduced to them. If you're presenting at a demo day, you will be introduced to a whole bunch simultaneously. But even if you are, you should supplement this with intros you collect yourself. Do you have to be introduced? In phase 2, yes, some investors will let you email them a business plan, but you can tell them from the way their sites are organized that they don't really want startups to approach them directly. Intros vary greatly in effectiveness. The best type of intro is a well-known investor is from a well-known investor who has just invested in you. So when you get an investor to commit, ask them to introduce you to another investors they respect. The best type of intro is from the founder of the company they founded. You can get intros from other people in startup communities like lawyers, reporters, etc. There are few. There are now sites like AngelList, Founders Club, and WeFounder that can introduce you to investors. We recommend startups treat them as auxiliary sources of money. Raise money first from the leads you get yourself. Those will, on average, be better investors. Plus, you will have an easier time raising money on these sites once you can say you already raised some from well known investors. Here, no till you hear yes. I mentioned earlier that investors prefer to wait if they can. What's particularly dangerous for founders is the way they wait. Essentially, they lead you on. They seem like they're about to invest right up till the moment they say no. If they even say no, some of the worst ones never actually do say no. They just stop replying to your emails. They hope that way to get a free option on investing. If they decide later that they want to invest, usually because they've heard you're a hot deal, they can pretend they just got distracted and restart the conversation as if they'd been about to. That's not the worst thing investors will do. Some will use language that makes it sounds like as if they're committing, but which doesn't actually commit them. And wishful thinking founders are happy to meet them halfway. Fortunately, the next rule is the tactic for neutralizing this behavior. But to work, it depends on you not being tricked by the no's that sound like yes. Ouch! Oh my god, I'm hurting myself all the fucking time. Blood everywhere. Holy shit. Weird. Where's my fucking. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know fucking thing. Oh god. Anyways, it's so common for founders to be misled or mistaken about this that we designed a protocol to fix the problem. If you believe an investor has committed, get to them to confirm it. If you and they have different views of reality, whether the source of the discrepancy or the sketchiness or your visual thinking, the prospect of confirming a commitment in writing will flush out. And till they confirm, regard them as saying no. Do breadth first search weighted by expected value. When you talk to investors, your MO should be breadth first search. Motto? Is that it? What is M.O? What's M.O? Not this. Modus operandi. Mode of operating. Okay. Mode of operating. Weighted by expected value, you should always talk to investors in parallel rather than serially. You can't afford the time it takes to talk to investors serially. Plus, if you only talk to one investor at a time, you don't have the pressure of other investors to make them act. But you shouldn't pay the same attention to every investor because some are more promising prospects than others. The optimal solution is to talk to all potential investors in parallel, but give higher priority to the more promising ones. Expected value. How likely an investor is to say yes, multiplied by how good it would be if they did. For example, an eminent investors who would invest in a lot but will be hard to convince might have some same expected value as an obscure angel who won't invest much but will be easy to convince. Whereas an obscure angel who will only invest in small amount and yet needs to meet multiple times before making up his mind, he has very low expected value. Meet such investors last, if at all. Gosh, what am I doing? Doing breadth for search weighted by expected value will save you from investors who never explicitly say no but merely drift away, because you'll drift away from them at the same rate. It protects you from investors who flake in much the same way that disturbed algorithm protects you from procedures that fail. If some investors isn't returning your emails or wants to have a lot of meetings but isn't as progressing towards making you an offer, you automatically focus less on them. But you have to be disciplined about assigning probabilities. You can't let how much you want an investor influence your estimate of how much they want you. Know where you stand. How do you judge how well you're doing with an investors when investors habitually seem more positive than they are? By looking at their actions rather than the words. Every investor has same track they need to move along from the first conversation to wiring the money, and then you should also always know what tracks consist of, where you're on it, and how fast you're moving forward. Never leave a meeting with an investor without asking what happens next. What more do they need to order to decide? Do they need in order to decide? Do they need another meeting with you? Talk about it what? To talk about what and how soon? Do they need to do something internally, like talk to their partners or investors, investigate some issue? How long do they expect it to take? Don't be too pushy, but know where you stand. If investors are vague and resistant answering their questions, assume the worst. Investors who are seriously interested in you will usually happy to talk about what is what has to happen between now and wiring the money because they are already running through that in their heads. I'm so sleepy. If you're experienced at negotiations, you already know how to ask such questions. If you're not, there's a trick you can use in the situation. Investors know you're inexperienced at raising money. Inexperience there doesn't make you unattractive. Being a noob at a technology would. If you're starting a technology startup, but not being a noob at fundraising, Larry and Sergey, the noobs, it's a fundraising. So you can just confess that you're inexperienced at this and ask how the process works and where you're in it. Get the first commitment. The biggest factor of most investors' opinions is the opinion of the other investors. Once you start getting investors to commit, it becomes increasingly easy to get more too. But the other side of the coin is that it's often hard to get the first commitment. Getting the first substantial offer can be half the total difficulty of fundraising. What counts as a substantial offer depends on how it's from and how much is it. Money from friends and family doesn't usually count, no matter how much. If you get 50K from a well-known VC firm or an angel investor, that will usually be enough to set things rolling. Close committed money. It's not a deal till money is in the bank. I often hear inexperienced founders say like we raised $80,000, $800,000 only to discover that zero of it is in the bank so far. Remember that twin fears that torment investors: the fear of missing out that makes them jump early, and the fear of jumping in onto a tower that results. Okay, this is a market where people are exceptionally prone to buyer's remorse. It's also one of the furnitures that. This is so freaking. Oh my god, it's so cold. And my back hurts. Oh god. What am I doing? Oh gosh. I got work. I need to read. I need to. I need to start my new project. I need to continue my fucking startup. What am I doing? I don't have employees. I have to manage everything myself. I even got deadlines today. I got an exam tomorrow. What the fuck is happening to me? I'll just stop it there. Alright.